Good afternoon, bonjour, bienvenue, welcome. My name is Jean Lebel, and I'm the Director of the Agriculture and Environment Program here at the International Development Research Center, where you are visiting us. So welcome everyone, et en particulier des...
I would especially like to welcome the Italian ambassador, His Excellency Andrea Meloni. Thank you for coming, and as well, High Commissioner for India, His Excellency S.M. Gavek. Well,
yes, what promised to be a very interesting public lecture. Le CRDI existe depuis 40 ans.
IDRC was created 40 years ago by a parliamentary act, and its mandate essentially is to help develop research capacities in developing regions and countries, and to give researchers in the regions the opportunity to answer the questions, what must we do, and to try and help them better develop and find sustainable solutions.
IDRC has launched its lecture series, its 40th anniversary lecture series, inviting prominent speakers to give talk on what they have accomplished, what they see for research for development in the future. And today, we have the honor of receiving Professor Mankumbu Sambhavisam Swaminathan, also very well known as simply Professor Swaminathan. Professor Swaminathan makes us the honor to stop in Ottawa in his way to University of Alberta, where he will receive an honorary degree, the first Canadian one in his career, where he received over 60, and delivered the Bentley Lecture in Sustainable Agriculture. So thank you for accepting to stop in Ottawa. As many of you know, Dr. Swaminathan received throughout his career quantities of distinguished prize, recognition, and award, and I will not go through the entire list because we would spend probably a large section of the afternoon on this. I will simply trace back a little bit his career and the common trend that has been present in his career. From its early days in India, where he got a first degree in zoology, then got another one in agricultural science, received a UNESCO grant to visit Wageningen University in the Netherlands, where he started to work on potatoes, on high-yield variety potatoes. Continue his progression towards Cambridge, where he received his PhD working on potato, and then went to the US, to Wisconsin, to continue to work on potatoes as a postdoc associate professor, and was really successful in his studies and started already to emerge as one of the most brilliant agricultural scientists that we had in the last century. He was solicited at that time by many universities and agencies to pursue a US career. But he remained always true to going back to India and to do his career in India. So he went back with his wife that he had met during his study, start working on rice, and then rapidly move into wheat. And I'm sure he has something to tell about how to move from potato to rice and to wheat. And contributed to a very significant impact in the world at that time, is to launch and to work on the Green Revolution in India with the introduction of dwarf wheat that Dr. Norman Borlaug had already started to work in Mexico. And if I can say maybe, it was thanks to Dr. Swaminathan and others, but largely because of Dr. Swaminathan, that the proof of concept got beyond the experience of Mexico and was demonstrated in a scale that was never seen before in a record time, that they could boost productivity. And I think there was a lot of learning that took place at that moment. Parcel and acreage that were yielding to about 3 million tons on average, very rapidly start to produce, above 30% of that and reaching, I think 75 million in some cases. That's an interesting and fascinating story that I'm sure Dr. Swaminathan might talk to us about this afternoon. But it was also a time where start to emerge challenges. Use of water, use of agrochemical, and Dr. Swaminathan always shows sensitivity to these issues. And more fundamentally, he always kept the poor farmer at the center of his interests. And throughout his career, he has not only looked into how to improve the productivity, but also how to make sure that the poorest benefit from those increasing productivity, and also how can we address, as we are moving with progress, the challenge of sustainability, be it at the social level or the environmental level. He had a great career. He was director of the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, one of the CGIAR Center. He also contributed significantly to the creation of ICRISAT. And in 1988, he moved to create his own organization, the Ms Swaminathan Foundation, where scientists and farmers, and particularly women's farmers in many cases, looks at how to do better agriculture, more sustainable agriculture, and in the term that he has coined, an Evergreen Revolution. In the last decade, we cannot neglect the role that he had played in bringing the information and communication technologies to the reality of the agriculture. IDRC has sponsored some of this early work where Dr. Swaminathan and his researchers have demonstrated that not only ICT were useful, but were the most useful for the very poor, be it in terms of accessing information that are critical for agriculture, weather, rain, or for fishing, tide, sea condition, as well as accessing market. What is the best price that can be get on local market or regional market? How can these poor farmers participate to value chain, to market? This work is ongoing, and I'm sure he will touch on it. But now, he's talking to us about sustainable food security in the area of climate change, a dimension that goes well beyond our own capacity to understand precisely what are the changes that are taking place globally. But as for many other challenges that he had in his career as a scientist, he has always said, I think, to have more challenge than to look at all things. And today, he will entertain us about this topic. Alors,
it's always a great pleasure for me, and this is the second time in my career that I'm able to present Dr. Swaminathan and to greet him here at IDRC, and I'm very moved to recognize in him, as many have done, one of the fathers of the Green Revolution in India, but one of these scientists who have had the most influence on the agricultural world and well beyond.
The limitation and the needs to continue research to understand better and find better solution. So from Green Revolution to Evergreen Revolution, it's a pleasure for me to introduce an ever young scientist and bright mind, Dr. Ms Swaminathan. Welcome.
Thank you very much for this over-generous introduction, John. Thank you. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be once again in the IDRC building. Since IDRC is commemorating its 40th anniversary, you will pardon me for a few minutes I will take to describe the work of IDRC in relation to the topic for today. I have been watching with admiration the birth and growth of this organization. From its birth to now to present day, I've had a very long association with IDRC. May I say, I think the The vision behind IDRC's formation was a wonderful one, and I would just want to quote the three of the early architects of IDRC, Lester Pearson, Maurice Strong, and of course its first very distinguished head, Dr. David Hopper, whom I had known because he was working at the time. He was invited to become the head of IDRC at the institute in Delhi, the Indian Agricultural Research Institute, which I was then heading. He was our very distinguished professor of agricultural economics when he was invited by Lester Pearson, Maurice Strong to come back to Canada and lead the IDRC. Lester Pearson, in his papers, which Rohinton kindly gave me, says the idea of the center is to examine the issue of farmers, the production and distribution of food, and the control of global climate. For nearly 40 years ago, he talks about the control of global climate, and among other things. Maurice Strong was a great institution builder. He has left his footprints on so many institutions all over the world, UNEP. Even the term CGIAR, consultative group, was suggested by him at the Bellagio meeting. Maurice Strong says, given that knowledge is the principal source of wealth creation, if the education gap between developed and developing countries is not closed, then the development gap will just widen. That's a very beautiful way. If the education gap is not closed, the development gap will widen. And because and in today's world, more and more a knowledge-based economy. Knowledge is power. After all, the greatest, wealthiest person, if you see in the Forbes list, starting with Bill Gates and so on, it was purely IPR, intellectual power, knowledge power, which has taken them to that state. David Hopper, who set the basic foundation for this institution, IDRC should focus on farm and non-farm people living in rural areas, as these are the global citizens who have been most affected by the change from the Neolithic to modern. And I think it was also a great good fortune. IDRC's early principal movers of IDRC's program, one of them is here, the head of the Agriculture, Food and Nutrition Sciences, Dr. Joseph Hulse. A remarkable work in the first 10 years. From what I have read and what they have been, the vision to action has been a remarkable one. And Joe is one of the most widely respected world scientists in the area of food. Every one of them. Information sciences was also, at that time, 1970, information sciences headed by John Woolston was one of those earlier. It's a great vision, I must say. And I will come to it a little later. And of course, social sciences and so on. The other aspect of IDRC's work in the last 40 years has been to help create so many new institutions, apart from their own programs. CGIAR, many of the CGIAR institutions, including ICARDA, for example, Joe Hulse and others were involved in great. The World Agroforestry Center, I still recall in 1976 or 77, there was a meeting in Albert Street when the IDRC was there. And the question was, there was a paper by John Benet on forest trees. And what can we do with that paper? Shall we do? Then I was one of those 4 or 5 invited for a consultation. We decided that we must set up a World Agroforestry Center. At that time, it was called the ICRAF, International Council for Agroforestry. Now it is called the World Agroforestry Center in Nairobi. I must say it has become a remarkable institution. Again, a foresight to have taken that area for a more detailed scientific analysis and implementation. For example, today later on we'll talk about mitigation in terms of climate change. One of the most powerful methods is build up soil carbon banks. A lot of carbon is kept in the ocean, but soil can also be storing a lot of soil carbon banks. The World Agroforestry Center has identified many trees in Africa, Phaidherbia albida, for example, what they call fertilizer trees, which have double advantage. One is to fix fertilizer in the soil, upgrade the soil health. Secondly, how to build up soil carbon banks, which again enhance productivity very considerably. Similarly, many other institutions, farming systems research, post-harvest technology, aquaculture, these are all important from the point of view of both sustainability as well as additional income. Farming systems research, for example, which IDRC promoted, entirely IDRC's promotion in the early years. One method of trying to maximize the benefits of the available land and water and labor. How much more income can you get by crop livestock integration or crop livestock fish integration, and so on. The post-harvest technology, even today in my country, one of the major problems we face is a mismatch between production technology and post-harvest technology. Production has gone up, but the storage, harvesting, handling, storage, they are still poor. And you don't get, neither the consumer nor the producer gets full benefit from production if your post-harvest technology is very weak. IDRC was the only organization for a long time supporting post-harvest technology. And then the underutilized crops, mainly the millets. Now they have all come into prominence because they are much more climate resilient, in the sense more drought hardy. You can have a whole series of crops which are much more resilient to climate variability. So the so-called orphan crops or the underutilized crops, again like millets, a whole series of millets and pulses, the grain legumes, and the minor oil seeds. In my own country, safflower, Niger, one of the early projects we negotiated with Joe Hulse when I was the head of the Indian Council of Agricultural Research was in the area of these minor oil seeds, which are not receiving the same attention as others. I can go on talking about IDRC and its contributions, but it's a continuing contribution. It's one of those which has really opened up a new pathway of looking, international development, research which promotes development. And it has now become a research which promotes sustainable development. A term was mentioned by John, that Evergreen Revolution. Long ago, when the term Green Revolution, as you know, was coined by William Gard of the United States in 1968, he called it a green. Earlier, Indira Gandhi in my country had released a stamp called the Wheat Revolution. But then the rice revolution was going on. Already the corn revolution was there, starting. Probably the earliest green revolution was in hybrid corn in Iowa. From that time onwards, we have had a whole series of revolutionary progress in agriculture. So the green revolution, Mr. Gard felt, green is the color of chlorophyll, green plants. After all, we are all guests of the green plants. If you analyze it, without green plant, none of us will be here, because the animals can only survive on the green plant. They are not primary producers of energy. They are only secondary converters of energy. Therefore, he said the green revolution means you are absorbing more sunlight. It's a solar energy harvesting enterprise. But then, soon afterwards, in 1968, this term was coined. By 1971, there were a lot of critics of the so-called green revolution. One set of critics was from the economic side, because the petroleum products, suddenly the petroleum prices went up. And since they are the feedstock for fertilizer industry, many of the pesticides, the input costs also went up. So one point from the social sciences was inputs are needed for output. And if you don't have money to buy those costly inputs, then you are bypassed by technology. And so there was a social inequity, built-in inequity in technology. The environmentalists were even more, because Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, had already been published in the early 60s in the United States. People were becoming conscious of the use of pesticides, chemical fertilizer, groundwater contamination, and so on. Many of them were later on dealt with by the Brundtland Commission on Sustainable Development. I used the term Evergreen Revolution in a lecture at the Indian Science Congress in 1968. I didn't use the word evergreen at that time, the Green Revolution, but the concept of the Evergreen Revolution, namely continuous improvement and productivity in perpetuity without associated ecological or social harm. I define this as increase in productivity in perpetuity without associated ecological or social harm. In other words, social harm, the most important is the gender discrimination. There is a book by Vandana Shiva which talks about violence of the Green Revolution in terms of women, because many of them were displaced from jobs and so on. So it is important that we mainstream ecology and equity, particularly gender equity, in technology development and dissemination. This is the major methodology of Evergreen Revolution, mainstreaming ecology and gender equity, gender and social equity in terms of technology development and dissemination. Well, I will come to it in our conversation with, but today the world is again in a state of crisis in one sense on the food front. One is the very large number of people who are going to bed tonight malnourished or undernourished. Recently, last month, there was this meeting in New York to consider the progress we have made during the first 10 years of the Millennium Development Goal Framework, that is 2000 to 2015. In the year 2000, when the MDGs were adopted, the very first one was poverty and hunger, because these are also related. A large part of the problem today of hunger is economic access to food. If you've got money, the shops are all full of food. Even in my country, shops are full of food, vegetables, fruits, and so on. Unless you have the money, how do you really buy them? And therefore, the economic access to food has become exceedingly important. And we find that, according to FAO, last year over 1 billion. It was 800 million in the year 2000. It should have been now, according to the progressive reduction, should have come to 600 or so. Instead of that, it has grown to 1 billion, and now this year they say there's a slight improvement of 950 million or so. In other words, the very first goal of the UN Millennium Development Goal, we are not achieving. We are not achieving, and it has consequently many other goals are related really. Gender problem, maternal mortality rate, infant mortality rate, and so on. They are all related to the whole question of food security. Even HIV/AIDS patients we find in India, many of them are very poor. Unless it is a food-cum-drug approach, purely a drug approach alone doesn't help. Malaria, tuberculosis, leprosy, HIV/AIDS. In all these cases, your approach has to be a combined one of food-cum-drug approach, not just giving the drugs alone to the people who are undernourished and so on. So how do we then, in the next 5 years, for example, 2015, can the world see accelerated progress in eliminating hunger and poverty, and associated problems of mortality rate, infant mortality rate, low birth weight babies. And I started by quoting the knowledge era. And you know, the low birth weight babies, we know the cognitive abilities are affected if you have got as a result of maternal and fetal undernutrition and malnutrition. If the baby born is a low birth weight baby, then it has got from birth the cruelest form of iniquity. The cruelest form of iniquity is to deny the child at birth an opportunity for the full expression of its innate potential for mental and physical development. So we have many problems, growing inequity in the world. That's also reflected by growing degree of violence in the human heart. There is a feeling among people that the world is cruel to them, and it manifests itself in a number of other ways, and as I said, without peace and security, you can't make progress. So let me again thank IDRC for asking me to share some thoughts. Look forward to our conversation. But I will, before I sit down, I want to pay a tribute to IDRC, the way in which it has become a unique organization. It has helped, and our information technology program in my own country, in my own center, has helped one of the most powerful tools to make ordinary people to extraordinary people. You know, we start with ordinary people. At the end of 4 years, you are dealing with extraordinary people. When I say this, is not, and many of them are, most of them are women. The woman in the project supported jointly by IDRC on what we call rural knowledge centers, village knowledge centers. These women today, formerly they had not even stepped out of their house. Today they have gone to Tunis, they have gone to Geneva, the World Information Society summits, and given talks and so on. It's a complete transformation. It's a transformational technology. There are technology. The wheat, the small dwarf wheat was a transformational technology. It was not an ordinary. That's why it led to a revolution. Otherwise, it won't lead to a revolution. ICT is a transformational technology. And the cell phone, internet combination is one of the most powerful combinations. So the IDRC had sown the seeds of so many technological empowerment of the poor. That has been the only method, because the knowledge is more strong. So long as you've got the education gap, the knowledge gap, then the development gap will continue to expand. And IDRC, true to its name, research, international development research, has shown methods by which these problems can be overcome, and we look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My microphone is on. Let me give you a little bit of the rule of the afternoon. And before I do so, given that I'm not Larry King, neither Barbara Walters, or that I don't have any training in interviewing, I just want to make everyone comfortable using one of the two official languages of Canada. And we have, I think, ears set for translation if people need them now. And if you are coming to the mic at one moment with a question in French, it will be a pleasure also for me to translate it to Dr. Swaminathan. And also, before I forget, we are broadcast live on the web. And we have an audience out there that might ask questions. In fact, I'm already seeing one question that came on the monitor over here. So I would welcome you also, because I didn't do it before on the web, and also ask you, if you are sending us a question to ask Dr. Swaminathan, can you please identify yourself by your name and the organization or the group that you are representing? It would be very kind from you. Thank you very much, and welcome to this interesting conversation with Dr. Swaminathan. Dr. Swaminathan, I'm going to start the conversation with you, asking you, taking the privilege of being with you and asking you one question, and then we'll move directly to the floor, if you don't mind, or to the monitor. And in fact, I have two questions. And, you know, I have the formal one that is the substantive one, but I have the one that is coming back, and I'm often asking a researcher. And, you know, thanks for your very kind word. You are saying that, you know, often IDRC change ordinary people into extraordinary people. But I can tell you that it's not a one-way street. You change many people. You, as a researcher and other researcher, change IDRC staff and the way they were seeing the world and the way they were promoting research. And you made us better people also. So thank you for this. When you were a young boy in India, what was the sparkling moment that drives you to become a scientist?
Well, when I was a young boy, question is, my father was a medical doctor. And like many in those days, I'm talking about the 1930s, many in those days, they were all involved in Gandhi's movement for independence of India from colonial rule. We were brought up in that atmosphere, and what I learned from my father was the town where we were living was full of filarial mosquito, filariasis. It goes into different forms of expression of swollen food and so on. He decided that he should. He used to say, filariasis or this mosquito is not a God-given problem. It's a man-made problem, so only human solutions are to be found. He stood as a chairman of the municipal election to get some authority. And within 1 year, he eradicated the mosquito by only two methods, by education and by social mobilization. In each street, he showed people, this is where the mosquito is breeding. Do you want this breeding ground? If you don't want it, you close it. If you want it, then at that time, there was no DDT. I'm talking about before World War II. Spray some crude oil emulsion to make the mosquito. Within 1 year, a chronic problem is gone. So this power of education and social mobilization has always remained with me. So when we had some products to give it to the farmers, I knew that unless the farmers, first of all, see for themselves that this is something which is useful to them, and at the same time, they should also work together in many areas and so on. So the motivation, when, of course, going to agriculture, I was groomed to be a medical doctor really, because my father's hospital, he had built a very nice hospital, and he died very young. And so my mother was keen I should take over the hospital and run it. And so I was, but that was the time when the Bengal Famine took place, 42, 43. And you know, all of us students used to ask ourselves, we know that the colonial rule was almost ending. It was the last phase of during the World War II. in what way we can help. I decided I will go to, so I took another degree in agriculture. From my first bachelor's, I went to the agricultural college at Coimbatore and did another degree. And then decided also to specialize in genetics because I thought seed can be the starting point. You know, we say we reap as we sow is the normal. In agriculture, we say we reap as we sow. This is true in every case. So I decided that I must go into genetics and breeding, and that is how gradually my future was shaped.
And that was essentially the thread that drives you throughout your career, getting rid of hunger, malnutrition, securing that people were better off. And in the talk that you presented to us, you know, you were closing on the Millennium Development Goal. And it's funny because the first intervention that we got from the webs from a lady called Véronique Barnes, who is at the à l'École Nationale d'Administration Publique, refers to the Millennium Development Goal. And having seen the report of the FAO 2 weeks ago on, you know, the achievement of the first one, having seen the data of last month, the New York conference, why haven't we made in as much progress that we should have been doing? And particularly on, you know, hunger and malnutrition. Although there was a lot of, you know, media coverage about that, the absolute number are going a little bit down. You know, 800 million or 1 billion of people that goes to bed hungry is still an unacceptable and will ever be an acceptable amount. But where have we failed, if I may use the term, not to reach those targets or not to be on our way to reach those targets, and particularly the first one on food and hunger?
It's a good question here also. Somebody is asking the same question. Why are we having difficulty? After all, we say food is the first in the hierarchical needs of a human being, the first in the hierarchical needs. Still, we are having so much problem in overcoming hunger. It is increasing, and that's what you are asking. I believe there is no generic answer, but it has to be disaggregated country by country. Every country must have a total commitment to freedom from hunger. And then the real problem in this area is the need for convergence among so many actions. So much of action has to come together. Starting, for example, land rights, land ownership, land reform, agrarian reform. Many cases the ownership is unequal unless farmers have a stake in their own. Then the supply of the inputs, tremendous amount of coordinated activity is needed. Many cases it is missing. If you take food security apart from agriculture, after all, food security has 3 major components. The first is availability of food, which is a function of production. That farmers will have to produce aquaculture, everything. The second is access to food. Most of the public policy intervention concentrate on access. That is, how do you make it cheap? In my own country now, you know, we have come away from a purely patronage approach. Gandhi always said, you want food with human dignity, and not make everybody into a beggar. It must be a food with human dignity. Everybody must earn their own daily bread. In the last 10 years, we have come away from a patronage to a rights approach. Right to information, right to education, right to health care, and also land rights to the tribal, what we call the indigenous people, and so on. All of them. Today, the final step in this end is the right to food, or Food Entitlements Act. This is being now, the government has promised, the present government, that they will bring into a legislation for making food entitlement a right to the people, not at a low price. The idea is to economic access to food, but still this will need the physical availability of food. That is, only a farmer can do it. In my own country, I used to say the right to information can be implemented with the help of files. The right to food can be implemented only with the help of farmers. If the farmers are not producing more, you can't enforce that kind of right, because international prices are very volatile. This year, the Russians banned the export of wheat. The prices have gone up enormously. A few years ago, when the petroleum prices went way up, all the prices went up enormously, and so on. So we need, so one is this availability. The other is finally absorption of food in the body. The ability to absorb the food in the body depends upon clean drinking water. Many people don't think food security, we talk only with so many million tons of food grains. That's all enough, a leaky, what we call a leaky pot, the child may have developed diarrhea. Fortunately today, with the oral rehydration therapy, there is no mortality with diarrhea. Formerly, diarrhea was a great killer. After the development of the oral rehydration therapy in our Bangladesh Institute, then you have a problem. So the absorption of food in the body, the availability of food, both food and non-food factors, there is need for a great deal of convergence of action, both in policy and in action. That is not happening. That is not happening because so I would say it's a governance of the delivery of nutrition safety net program, using the economic terms of nutrition safety nets. The governance aspect of the delivery of the nutrition, even if a country has a commitment, the delivery itself without corruption, without so on. There are variability in the world. There are some countries. In India, we can achieve it by putting some convergence and synergy among numerous programs. There are problems in African countries in terms of the first step, availability of food, which is a function of production. Production and productivity have to be enhanced. Land is going out of agriculture. The young people don't want to come to agriculture anymore. Attracting and retaining youth in farming is the major challenge today. They don't want to come. So agriculture has a number of social problems. And if ultimately farm ecology and farm economics go wrong, nothing else will go right. Ecological problems, over-exploitation of land, over-exploitation of groundwater. In India, in the heartland of the Green Revolution, Punjab, Haryana, there has been over-exploitation of groundwater. There is salinity which is coming up, the soil degradation. So it requires a much more coordinated action, which we find is, unless the very capable governance mechanisms are there, the possibility of abolishing hunger is very much there. Even today, the world has enough food. There's not a question of how to make people available. It's a complex question and can be done only by local political action, and regional and global political action. I think all of them at all levels we require a very high degree of commitment to make UN MDG number one, the number one priority of the world. After calling it number one, if you don't give that priority which is needed, then you won't.
Well, thanks, because you're giving us the basis of the food security, the production, the storage, the distribution, and also the nutritional aspect. I think that are key. The very complex field that is agriculture, because agriculture alone is not agriculture. It touches on so many other issues. And also the need for coordinated action. And while the audience prepares its question, please feel free. We have one person. I'll come to you shortly. I'll ask you, and that will be my last one. Coordination of action that you're talking and, aligning with the Millennium Development Goal. What is to learn from the early Green Revolution? Wasn't there coordinated action there? And you felt and you saw what were the shortfall, and we are still seeing it and we are struggling to do better. But was this the first secret in the Green Revolution in India?
See, the Green Revolution kind of progress which took place, after all, a revolutionary progress is different from evolutionary progress. Evolutionary progress is 2%, 3% growth rate. When suddenly you had a different kind of growth rate, 100%, 200% yield and so on, it was triggered by four essential elements. We call it a Green Revolution symphony. We don't call it a purely green. It was like a good symphony. Many things have to come together. No discordant voice, everybody is... Number one is technology. Technology is the primer of change. That is why in my initial introduction also I said transformational technologies like ICT, for example. The cell phone is a mobile phone, is a transformational technology. It changes the life. Today people are not able to live without it and so on. It changes the... So technology. The second is technology can be on the shelf, but how do you take it to the field? The various services, including extension, seeds. I can say I have a new variety, but farmers have no... What you use it is unless the seeds are available. Seeds, water, fertilizer, electricity. So this whole area of services. third, public policies in terms of input-output pricing. The economics of farming has to be attractive to the farmers. The prices of inputs, whether it is fertilizer, seeds and water, electricity, and also the whole question of output pricing. Assured and remunerative marketing is finally the most important incentive to farmers. At the end of the day, when they have harvested, if you don't get a good price and a good market, in fact, Dr. Norman Borlaug himself told me one of his frustration in Africa was he can show how to increase production and productivity, but then the farmers have to derive benefit from it unless there is a mechanism of purchase market. But all the three, technology, services, public policies, but the ultimate thing is farming is a private sector enterprise. In India, it is the largest private sector enterprise. I tell the Confederation of Indian Industry, you fellows don't think you have omitted the most important, the largest private sector enterprise where 600 million people are involved in India, 600 million people. Now, unless they are enthusiastic, farmers' enthusiasm, you have to see it to believe it. In the 60s, particularly the Punjab, what we call the Sikh farmers, farming is in their blood. When they saw a new opportunity, they grabbed it like fish taking to water. They just grabbed it. Today, you find the farmers of the world, not only in India, don't find the same enthusiasm because there are so many imponderables, including climate change, which is going to top the problem, drought, floods, power, electricity, markets. If they produce more, they suffer more. Assured marketing. In India, two crops in which the government buys, wheat and rice. That is why consistently from about 5 million tons in 47 to 80 million tons, 82 million tons this year, it has always never looked back. It has because there is an assured market there as soon as the farmers come. Same is rice. But in other crops, it is not so. In the grain legumes, we were talking about pulses during lunchtime and oil seeds. Many of them are fluctuating prices. If they produce more, then the farmers suffer more. So you have to bring all these four together, the technology, the services, the public policies, which lead to the economics of farming. And finally, above all, the farmers' own enthusiasm. Some social prestige must be given to farmers. You see, most countries, farmers are not given any importance at all. Even when I went to an agricultural college, the principal asked me, "You have got very good marks, why are you coming here?" And so I said, is it a sin to come to the agricultural college with the good marks? So the attitude, mindset was, first you should go to engineering, medical, ICT, and so on. If you don't get anything at all, then you go to agriculture. This is true in many developing countries, not only in mine, many developing. So we have to bring more social prestige to the farmers. And
thanks. We'll get to the audience now and start listening to what are the questions coming from them. So if you can please introduce yourself, your name, the organization you're representing. Be brief because we want to maximize participation from the audience with your question. I would really appreciate. And we're going to take 3 in a row, so that will give you time to think about the answers. So we'll start with you. We'll go to the other side to you, sir, and then come back to you. Please.
Thank you. I'm Nand Tandon, a retired civil servant here. You talked about sustainable development, Evergreen Revolution, and an important ingredient or challenge, I should say, in that would be water, not only in India but elsewhere. In India, for instance, in Punjab, which I know a little bit, you have to dig deeper and deeper to get any water out, and also the quality of the water is probably not as good either. So is there something being done to sort of meet that challenge of scarcity of water, especially since water seems to be needed more with fertilizers? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sir?
My name is Brian Hull, and I'm a member of the Hunger Project in Canada. And my question has to do with closing the education gap. And the question arises in this way. Early on in my participation in international development, I saw that part of the education gap was our, in the developed world, misunderstanding or unbalanced understanding of the way the developing world was and how our misunderstanding influenced what we did, but also influenced the understanding of people in developing countries about what is wanted and needed. And part of the education gap is this, is in this environment and with your specialty, we talk about food and the production of food. But one of the things I learned early on in my involvement of this was through reports of Canadian agricultural workers in then Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, under the Colombo Plan, where they noted that a community that had some vision for the future, that organized, that with very little external intervention could improve its own well-being, with some hope for the future, some stability. And the problem with that is there's nothing for us in the developed world in that kind of environment. There's not our agricultural expertise, our research, our technology to help, and yet bottom-up development appears where people take on their own future and begin to learn from abroad, appears to be one of the most powerful ways for a community to develop. And my question is, how do we close the education gap so that we, with our analytical, narrow, focused way on food only or on water only or on this only, begin to recognize that it's an integrated, as you called it, convergence, mobilization issue. It's a bottom-up issue, and that we need to be more sensitive to the need for that bottom-up approach. And in India, of course, I'm speaking to the most knowledgeable on this, my teacher, empowering women to make a more effective role in agriculture, as in most of the political life of India. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're going to take one last question in this round. Sir?
My name is Pravir Nyogi, and I'm a civil servant, but I asked this question purely in an individual capacity. My question to Dr. Swaminathan is this. There are 500 million cell phones, give or take a few million in India now, and a fair proportion of them are in the rural villages. But does a farmer not have to be of a certain size, a certain sophistication, and have a certain level of knowledge before he can use this extraordinary communications device to get the kind of information which would be directly helpful to him in his activities? I mean, social conversations are one thing, but the ability of a farmer to use a cell phone to extract useful information and how this is being done, what role, if any, the IDRC is playing, perhaps we could discuss this question further. I should say, by way of bias, that I work in the area of information and communication technologies.
Thank you for disclosing your bias. It's very important. So, Dr. Swaminathan, we have a question that relates to water. We have one that relates to educational gaps and now addressing also gender dimension. And this last one about, maybe landing the ICT on the ground with agricultural practice. You want to answer them in the order you want?
I'm happy to react. I think the first question about water is a very fundamental requirement. We can do nothing after all. There's no water, you have a desert. So water is very important. It is going to be one of the major constraints. And within the context of global climate change, whether more droughts, higher temperature means more evaporation, even 1 to 2 degrees centigrade more. We find that in the Punjab and in that area, about 7 million tons of wheat less production and so on. So the number of problems coming in relation to water. In India, we have a very highly skewed rainfall, what we call the monsoons, 2 monsoons. In most parts of India, most of the water comes, the rainfall comes within 100 hours in a year. Therefore, unless you harvest that water, you store it, you will have a problem. For example, when I was a young boy, I learned in the school book, the highest rainfall in the world is a place called Cherrapunji in Meghalaya, in Himalayas. And when I first went there personally, in the month of November, I couldn't get water. I said, this is the highest rainfall in the world. And they said, but in November and March, it's difficult to get water because they were not storing it, and you see a lot of deforestation, so the water was going down and causing flood, the Brahmaputra, Assam, those who know India. So with the result, we started a program of somehow persuading people to harvest and store the water. They are called jal kunds or water storage tanks. That has changed the whole area now, completely changed, rainwater. There is a large program called, it's now called Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Program, which guarantees employment, unskilled work for 100 days in a year per one individual from each family. If you don't have any other job, then you can go because a guarantee you have to get a job there. The highest priority to that particular program is water. In other words, water harvesting, watershed management is the major. One is labor. Gandhi used to say, marry intellect with labor. Labor and intellect, or brain and brawn must be married. If you want to have, if you want to get results from brawn, and the brain must be combined. So now, fortunately, this is happening with this enormous amount of labor all over the country. The highest priority has been given to water. We have a plan now. There's a called War for Water, not war for fight. War for water is, W is win-win for everybody, winnability. A is augmentation. R is recycling resource completely, all the wastewater. We are also going to launch shortly a fairly large program on seawater, converting seawater into fresh water, not by reverse osmosis or by solar dehydration, but through the plant, Fortunately, there are so many halophytes. So we have a large program which is going to be started soon of how along, because 25% of our population is along the coast, within 40, 50 kilometers from the coast. There, how do you really convert seawater into fresh water through the medium of halophytes, through the medium of the salt-tolerant plants? It's called the agri-aqua farms, both fish as well as agriculture. We have combined it with salt-tolerant varieties also, some of them by genetic modification and so on. So water is a key issue, and every country must have a strategy to meet the water for domestic purposes, the water for industrial purposes, the water for ecosystem services. Every year in Indonesia there are forest fires, and also even the US, I think California, forest fires, because if there is no water, if it is very dry, arid, then you have the forest fires. So we need for domestic agriculture. In India, nearly 75% of water goes to agriculture. Agriculture is the largest consumer of water. Then the domestic, the industrial, and the ecosystem services. For all of them, we must have an integrated strategy of water management, using all the sources of water, the rainwater, the river water, the groundwater, the recycled water, and the seawater. All sources of water must be. The second question from our friend from Hunger Project, because I was associated with Hunger Project. I think I'm still shown as emeritus chairman or something. And Dr. Joe Hulse has been doing a lot for the Hunger Project. The educational understanding, as I said, is, you see how ultimately education, in the case of the poor rural areas, education should also lead to some tangible benefit for them. I coined a term many years ago, in 72, called techneracy. Techneracy as the pathway to literacy. In other words, start with technical literacy by doing, learning by doing. They are called in India Krishi Vigyan Kendras, or farm science centers, where, for example, a tribal woman who is not ever gone to school today is able to extract a pituitary glands and do induced breeding of fish, because they're all taught by learning by doing, not by lecturing, and so on. So once you get into it, power of knowledge and power of education has to be dealt with both on the technical side, some utilitarian side, as well as education for education's sake. And today it has become possible with modern ICT. We have software, Tata Consultancy Services, there is one Azim Premji Foundation. They have developed software for literacy in 40 hours. What is called joyful learning. We find it very effective in terms of literacy. So we must go all out, but finally, unless there is also the enlightened self-interest on the part of people to become educated, so long as they are illiterate, they know their condition will be purely unskilled work, which can give you minimum wage, not more than that. This is why all the major leaders, social transformation leaders in India, have all concentrated on education. Education is the pathway to your own growth and development. So you have put but I won't give one uniform strategy. It varies from place to place. As I said, in the projects where we work, we use techneracy as a first step towards literacy. First, introduce the value of skills, and then you go into education. The third, about the cell phone and the IDRC's role, what we find with all this modern technology, whether it is internet or cable TV or FM radio and the cell phone, we use all the four in our village knowledge centers. Because the FM radio is also, before the cell phone came, the community radio or the FM radio was in the Green Revolution days, that was the most powerful communication, because the transistor radio doesn't cost you much. Every farmer carries to the field a transistor radio. And we started giving information through the radio. And many of the varieties were called radio varieties because they had heard it about the radio. They didn't know what so we have to use all the information sources. And I find two areas which are inadequately funded, inadequately attended to. One is content creation. Content creation is very important, because if you go to a village and talk to the women or men, unless the content is both dynamic content, not only generic content, dynamic in the sense the weather, you have to add value to the weather. If I show a satellite picture, it doesn't mean anything at all. The TV sets always show satellite picture, but they have to be converted into location-specific advice. In other words, value addition to primary information. Information becomes knowledge. That is why we call it a knowledge center. Of course, the ultimate progression is wisdom. It comes from the age and experience. But information has to be converted into knowledge by value addition. Location-specific information is needed. Capacity building and content creation are too important. In India itself, the first major initiative, I must say, in capacity building was taken by Microsoft. They have got a potential unlimited program and so on. The government puts a lot of money on infrastructure. We have 100,000 village knowledge centers which are funded by government. But that alone, having a couple of computers in a room, does not help unless you have the content. And as I said, the content must be dynamic. It must be location specific. It must be in the local language, in the language of the people of that area, unless they understand it. So all that requires some investment in capacity building, training, and so on. Again, the problem of convergence of different players is what the purely technocratic approach is, to put the knowledge centers and establish them. Now there is a realization. For example, in the centers we operate, we don't, because being a non-governmental organization, with the help of IDRC, we started the program in 1992, first with a workshop 20 years ago, the Village Knowledge Center movement. It has now spread. It has now spread, and also private sector, one of the leading companies called ITC, they have what they call e-Chowpals. Largely market information they give. At the right time, the market information is given. But they are now expanding it to health, all the other areas. For example, in all the places where we work, we give to the farmers an Entitlements Passbook. It is called Entitlements Passbook, which gives them information on all the schemes available to them from government. There are many of them in India, and how to access them, the officer's name and the address, the telephone number. You give everybody. It can be also social entitlement, not only in terms of agricultural entitlements. Entitlement, for example, simple thing in the state where I live, Tamil Nadu, one of the most progressive in terms of social. Long ago, they developed a scheme to give women support for mothers feeding, because we now say, WHO says 6 months of mother's milk is important to the baby. But then the mother is working. She has to go out for work to earn the daily bread. So the government gives them support. When we took a survey, more than 50% of the eligible women didn't know that there was a scheme of this kind. So you'll have to, empowerment of information is important. So giving a long answer to your question, but finally whether 500 million, 1 billion, whether they make an impact on the livelihoods of the people and their own economic well-being, depends upon some amount of additional work in terms of development of content creation and development of. If you do it, it is a very powerful tool. It's only, after all, any medium. It's a communication medium. What you communicate is what is important.
Thank you. Now, we're going to go into a second round of questions, and we have also someone on the web that has been bringing. But I'll ask the audience and the next speaker, or the next person that's going to ask you the question, maybe to frame their question with a little bit of climate change. Your talk was on sustainable food security in an era of climate change. There's many, and sir, if your question is not related to climate change, I see you moving in the line. Don't worry, you can still ask it. But in number of circle, Professor Swaminathan, you know, we're hearing that agriculture is a contributor to greenhouse gas emission, whether it's through the mechanization and the use of transportation for the product, whether it is through plowing of the field and emission of carbon from the soil, deforestation. And on the other hand, you know, we're hearing people that are saying, no, agriculture is really one of the best ways to mitigate the effect of climate change. You know, carbon sequestration in the soil, zero tillage, conservation agriculture, bringing smallholder at the forefront of the agenda. And this is the question of Mr. Ramirez, an independent consultant in Guelph, saying, you know, we have to go back to small farmer. The International Assessment on Agriculture, Science and Technology was saying small-scale farming is largely a solution to the problem. But the problem is that those small-scale farmers are disappearing because the promotion is all towards large-scale farming. So you see there's a debate over here outside that is transmitted by Mr. Ramirez. And I'll have your thought on this, maybe not now, but maybe through the question also that will be brought by the audience. So I'll start on this side of the audience this time for a round of 3 questions. Sir.
So, no climate change in this question. My contact with agriculture in Canada has been purely through the prism of trade policy. And I listened very carefully to your presentation, and I didn't hear the word trade policy at all. And I think if you looked at it from the perspective of India, it makes an awful lot of sense. It is a question of production, distribution, getting it to the people most in need. In Canada, I guess the question is, what do we trade and what do we not trade? We trade grains as efficient exporters. We don't trade dairy products because we're inefficient. So that's a sort of prism of how you bring trade policy into the Canadian context. In other parts of the world, it's a much more complex question, I think. If you look at it from the perspective of Africa, what do you do? I mean, do you expect, as you seem to suggest that every country has to derive its own food security through its complex of policies. It almost sounds to me as if it's autarky, and there's good reasons for that. I mean, you can justify it. Every country should feed itself. It's just bad luck on the prairie farmers when that happens, but it's not going to happen anytime soon, I suspect. And this gets into the question of what do you do with your borders? Do you allow for free movement of food, which will reduce the price of food, but will affect production in certain instances? In some cases it may be positive, some cases it may be negative. But the inclination I sense in Africa is we want to control the markets for food, mainly because power is not in the hands of producers, but in the hands of consumers in the cities, which regulate governments. I mean, regulate governments and tends to influence governments. What are your views on that? It's a vexed issue. I can see arguments on both sides, certainly. My own inclination is to say that you probably have to let global markets go and take over the bulk of feeding of the world, where this cannot be done through its own production. And do you favor the Doe round, or do you not favor the Doe round? Do you favor getting rid of agricultural subsidies in countries like Europe and the United States? Because if you succeed, the production level will drop, world prices will rise. I think that sums it up.
Thank you very much. And let me bring back the reminder to try to shorten your question, be brief, to give maximum opportunity. Michele.
My name is Michele Leone, and I work here at IDRC for the Climate Change and Water Program. And I have two short questions. One is related to climate change, the other not directly. So the one which is related to climate change is that, okay, given the fact that we are in a year of climate change, is that okay? Okay. I thought I was too loud. So given the fact that we are in a year of climate change, I think more and more knowledge integration between agricultural research center and meteorological center and weather forecast center will be needed. So my question is, what is your opinion that IDRC could do, and what is the role that IDRC could play in foster this integration even more? And the second question is, we had the pleasure some days ago to hear another talk from the founder of Grameen Bank on the importance of social business and microcredit for economic empowerment. And given the fact that you talked about economic empowerment of communities and of people as one of the most important constraint to the attainment of the first Millennium Development Goal, I would like to know what is your opinion of the role and the potential that social business has and microcredit has in this framework. Thank you.
And we're going to take a last one on this side, please.
My name is Naveen Patney. I'm a retired environmental engineering scientist from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada here in Ottawa. And my interest has been the environment and the greenhouse gases in sustainable agriculture. And the moderator brought up the point that the farms are getting bigger and bigger. And in Canada and the US, we have only got 2 or 3% of the population, which is feeding the rest of the 98, 97 people. And what I find is that also the consumption of meat has increased in the diets. And so what is happening is that, for example, in North Dakota, they switched from tobacco farming to pig production. So the pig production, North Dakota now, I believe, is the second largest pig producer in USA after Iowa. And all the feed that is fed to the pigs is brought from the Corn Belt in the US all the way to North Dakota. So here we are consuming resources, transportation. Agriculture produces only about 8 to 13% of the greenhouse gases in the world, or in Canada and USA. And we are increasing by transportation. And then the other thing is that we got these big farms, and the animal manure is creating a lot of problems in air pollution, water pollution, greenhouse gases. So my question, and you might want to comment on this, Dr. Norman Borlaug was here 5 years ago or 6 years ago, and he gave a lecture, and he said, to feed the world population, we have to keep using fertilizers all the time. And here we got a whole large amount of animal manure, which is not properly being utilized. And my concern is about depletion of natural gas, maybe in great-grandchildren's time, depletion of phosphate fertilizer, which is mined. So I'd like you to comment on this long-term sustainability, how we can increase the use of animal manure, which 100 years ago, the dominant chemist in Canada said that we are losing organic matter. So I'd like you to give a comment on that, please, on sustainability, greenhouse gas, climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Swaminathan, we'll come back to another round. We'll have a bit of time. There's always a moment in those public lecture and questioning where, I don't envy to be in your seat, is to answer all those different questions that have come. So feel free to really go to the point that you think are the most important to answer in order to address some of the challenge that has been brought by the person that raised the question?
Well, I think many of these questions are interrelated. You started by asking about the role of agriculture in mitigation, because generally we talk about adaptation to 1 degree, 2 degrees centigrade, to drought, floods, and so on. But the role of farming in mitigation is not as much emphasized or as much explored as in the case of other forms of mitigation, energy particularly. Energy is always in the top. Even I was in Copenhagen last year. There were some side events promoted by International Fund for Agriculture Development and so on, but the main event did not consider agriculture on the other hand, food security, water security, and livelihood security for a majority of people on the planet will be the most affected by climate change. All these three, food, water, and livelihoods, will be the most affected in the developing countries. And therefore, this question which you have raised is an important one. There are a large number of opportunities in terms of mitigation now it's gradually being understood. One I mentioned earlier, and apart from the new schemes for RED and so on, for keeping deforestation and promoting afforestation, so that there is some balance between carbon emissions and carbon absorption. That is one. But then the large soil carbon banks can be built up enormously by agroforestry and so on. We should lock up more carbon in the soil. It has double advantage. It's an advantage to get. In India, for example, we find fertilizer use efficiency has become low today, what we call factor productivity, because the organic matter soil carbon content has become very low, and therefore you don't get the full benefit from NPK and so on. So one has to, each country according to the role of agriculture, both in terms of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and the potential for absorption and potential for carbon storage, promoting the balance. Animal husbandry is a very important component. That's well known. Methane, one of the answers is biogas plants. The methane is used as energy rather than allowed to go. Ammonia volatilization can be prevented by neem-coated urea. Fertilizers can be coated with some kind of coatation. It reduces the whole ammonia volatilization. So there are a whole series of steps which can be taken through mitigation, but that requires both more extension work, knowledge work, and also financial support, which is not, because people have put it under the carpet. You see, they only blame agriculture, but what role agriculture can play in the overall mitigation is not, we hope it will now be more understood, and particularly, as you say, a small for the chain of, the production, distribution, consumption in Africa and so on. We call it, my center is 4 C's: conservation, cultivation, consumption, and commerce. All the 4 should go in an integrated system. Easy to mention all that, but difficult to, in many cases, how do you bring in conservation on one hand and cultivation. This I call evergreen agriculture. The Evergreen Revolution needs a pathway for how to achieve it. Productivity in perpetuity. It can be done both 2 ways. One is organic farming. The other is the evergreen agriculture, which deals with integrated pest management, integrated nutrient supply, scientific water management, water harvesting, and so on. In African context, unless any context, not only African, Indian context, any context, I think we have to have much more method of what I call techneracy, training by learning by doing, not only by lecturing, showing how it can be done. We hope this new Alliance for Green Revolution Africa, AGRA they call it, Kofi Annan, they will do something different from normal, because otherwise it will be one more scheme which will not be, it cannot be purely a technical approach. It has to be an approach in terms of understanding the culture and the human being, and the leaders of the revolution must come from below, their own people, the women and men, the rural women. If they become the leader, it spreads. That is what happened in the Green Revolution. Green Revolution was a small government program. It was made, a small government program became a mass movement. You don't have a revolution without a mass movement. It was a farmers' movement, and therefore government can be a catalyst. But on the other hand, the lead has to be taken. I don't find that interest. in capacity building and training the people. The climate change, the IDRC role, you will have to decide about. The greenhouse gases, the same question. I agree with you, the greenhouse gas emissions, water pollution, overuse of fertilizers. We now know all these problems. On the other hand, there are people who will say, I said, the pathway to Evergreen Revolution can be either organic farming or evergreen agriculture, which involves integrated pest management. You don't say you can't apply pesticide at all. You can't apply fertilizer at all. Minimum quantity which is needed according to circumstances. There is a great deal of lack of knowledge of sustainable, what are the steps for sustainability. It is easier probably to make a list of unsustainability and say these are not sustainable. But when you say sustainable agriculture, sustainable, one of the projects which IDRC helped is the Ivokrama Rainforest Program in Guyana. The then president, Mr. Desmond Hoyt, gave 1 million acres of very good rainforest to the Commonwealth and said, everybody coming to my country, Mr. President, you should manage your rainforest sustainably. And I tell him, Mr. Expert, I will give you some land. You show me how to manage it sustainably. What do you mean by sustainable management of a rainforest? Apart from purely words, how do you do? That is the challenge was given to the Commonwealth. And we took it up. The Ivokrama Rainforest Program is one of the best. And IDRC played a very key role in the early years and so on, including information technology. Martha Stone was there at the time. So there are possibilities. I would say that one of the books I have always recommended, and many of you have already read it, growing what Mr. Richard Lowe has called growing nature deficit disorder. Nature deficit disorder. In other words, in our computer age, we are not looking at the real world. We get glued to some machine all the time. The other is there are no faces before figures. Those talk about figures. 1 billion people are going to bed hungry. We go on tirelessly saying, even remember 10 or 15 of them whom you know. You put faces before figures, then you become much more involved, emotionally involved, spiritually involved. Mother Teresa used to call it the problem of whether disease or of hunger is the poverty of spirit. The poverty of spirit which leads to poverty of compassion. And if you do it all mechanically, you will never be able to achieve it all.
This is a very good word. And it makes me remember also IFAD president, Kanayo Kazambe, who is always saying, you know, statement, declaration, conferences do not change the face of the world. Only action in the field does. We're going to go into our last round of question. And, you know, I might ask the people coming to the mic to also, I'll guide them a little bit, but I don't think we have talked enough of gender in the conversation this afternoon. So maybe, you know, bring a little bit of gender dimension into what you were to ask to Dr. Swaminathan. So I see a smile on this face, and she says, no. I'll come back to you. We'll start with you, madam, please.
Sure. My name is Susie Walsh, and I work with an organization called USC Canada. Many in this room might remember it as Unitarian Service Committee. And we now focus entirely on the issue of food security, particularly food security in the Global South, as well as the idea of food sovereignty, which involves not only access to food, but the right to grow food, to grow healthy food, and to have some control over the food system. And to bring the gender dimension into it, smallholder women farmers have often been the most marginalized in that system, where they've had very little control over their minor crop. They are always called minor crops, which I think says something. But the question I have, I was wanting to bring up the IAASTD. We're very encouraged with this report, which does talk about the importance of ecological agriculture and the multifunctionality of agriculture. And I think many of the comments you've made today would lend me to think that you're supportive of this report, but I wouldn't mind hearing your thoughts on it. The second question, though, does relate to the issue of rights. I wondered if you could comment on the role that you think intellectual property rights, the patenting of seed, the prohibition in some ways of farmers being able to save their seed. If you could talk a little bit about how that might play into also this 100 billion or 1 billion hungry people on the planet. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to take only one question and only one short question for you. You, sir, and you that is standing up, and we'll have to wrap it up. And only one question and only one brief question. Please.
My name is Nuthan Kumar. I'm a student at the University of Ottawa in International Development and Globalization. My question is a little bit related to the other lady's question. I wanted to ask about the second green revolution that apparently is now taking place in India in partnership with Monsanto, Walmart, I believe, and another grocery retail store, where they're basically focusing on GM, genetically modified foods, and what the role of GM foods can play in increasing food security in India and the rest of the world.
Thank you very much. Sir?
Thank you. My name is Shiv Chopra. Professor Swaminathan, you and I have talked about this subject before, and I'd like to raise that again because it's become more and more important. That is the question of what do we do with the education system that Mahatma Gandhi talked about all his life, and unfortunately he got killed in the process and never has been followed. That is all education from age 4 to 18 should be given in schools around growing food. If we do that, there will be no need for GMOs, there'll be no need for pesticides, there'll be no, in fact, the food will be taken out of the economic equation. We will not have to transport it. It'll all become local, and nobody will ever go hungry again. I'd like your comments, please.
Thank you very much. You have the final question.
Julian Northey with Seeds Without Borders. Related to the very first two questions, actually, on the right to seed, how do you see the emerging multinational corporations in that context, given the fact that they do control seemingly over 50% of the global seed market?
Thank you very much. Dr. Swaminathan, the last question was the seed, the access to seed. That was your question?
Seed, huh?
Seeds. Seeds.
What is the question?
It relates to the first question that was asked by Madame Walsh from the seed and the right, the access to the seed. How do we secure the access to seed for the farmer?
Access to seed, huh?
Yeah, the access.
Well,
and we have a question on land rights. We have a question also on, let me remember, you probably have your note. I haven't taken my note. We have a question on GMOs, on the second green revolution in India, another one on education revolving around food security issue, and the last one being on seeds. Please.
No, I think, again, many of these questions relate to technology, what technology choice. What is the technology policy of a country in agriculture? What do you want to go? There are a number of ways of doing it. Like education, he talked about Mahatma Gandhi's, what we call basic education. You know, Gandhi felt Gram Swaraj, that is independence of the village, is the one which leads to the independence of a nation. In other words, build it from below, from bottom up, as we call it. Every village can be self-reliant to the extent it can. It cannot be, everybody cannot be self-reliant, everything, but basic issues like food, water, as he said, then you won't need all the GMOs and so on. People can produce the food they require, they can spin the cloth they require, and so on. So now, those were important concepts of, at a particular point of time in our country. The gender dimension in relation to food security, the woman's role, although in Africa we are always saying that women are largely the food farmers, while men go out for more commercial farming and so on. But women were never recognized as farmers, and given the kind of support system, the support systems which are needed, including, I would say, creches, daycare, health centers, because there are gender-specific needs. You can't simply say, go to women to agriculture. Then what will happen to the children? So the support systems which are needed for women, including the kind of machinery, small machinery, which were needed to reduce drudgery. I saw many years ago in North Korea, you found a difference between South Korea and North Korea. South Korea was so progressive, North Korea was very short of food. largely because almost all men were in the army. Agriculture was in the hands of women. If you go out to Pyongyang, 20 kilometers away, it's a very bad shape because they didn't provide a support system for women, the kind of small tractors which are needed. No work was done on the development of implements more which are gender sensitive. So I think the gender sensitivity must be mainstream in the whole public policy of the government, unless it should not be just say, no, we should do something for women. Even when I was chairman of the independent chairman of the FAO Council, large resolutions will come. Everywhere, finally, somebody will say women are missing, so including women they will put. That is not the way. It is just for formality's sake. A woman have to find some place there. But unless it is sort of mainstream in technology development, unless the technology development is engendered, public policy is engendered, you will never have the kind of woman's contribution which can be made. It will be an unrealized one. I am all for the Gandhiji's concept of education system, but no need for GMOs, pesticides, and so on. If you have people working together in an IPM, integrated pest management, if the whole village, because small farms, during lunch I was asking what is the concept of small farm in Canada. Somebody said 400 to 500 acres. I said in my country, it is 2.5 acres. 1 hectare becomes a small farm, and 80% of farmers are small farmers. If they will all join together, that Gandhi also said, he emphasized on social organization. He called it Sarvodaya. Sarvodaya means it's a win-win for everybody. There are no winners and losers. All of them will work together. And he also said Sarvodaya will come only through Antyodaya, that is attention to the poorest to the poor. You start with the poorest to the poor, otherwise you won't have a high synergy society. When you Sarvodaya society is a high synergy society. How do you create synergy in society is an important one. And access to seed again, you see ideally, increasingly commercial companies will produce only hybrid seed. Even my country, companies will produce only hybrid cotton, hybrid eggplant and so on, because otherwise the farmer will keep his own seed. 80% of seeds in India are farmers' own seed systems. The organized sector of seed industry hardly provides 15 to 20%. They provide only hybrid seeds. Hybrid means I have to buy every year. I have to go to them. So there are two ways of doing it. I had seen it in when the Chinese started hybrid rice. They had identified from Hainan Island a male sterile plant and prepared a hybrid rice. In the 1780s, they almost taught the villagers to produce their own hybrid seed, so that the village becomes self-sufficient. They don't have to. Now it has changed in China. It has very much changed the last 20 years. So I would say my own feeling would be that each village, if supposing you are going to go into hybrids, of course, companies will have to cooperate. They have to give the parent seed. If they can produce a small seed cooperative or a seed self-help group, we call them in India, a group of women or women and men who are self-help groups. If they can organize a seed self-help groups, they can make seeds. There must be a socially compatible strategy, culturally and socially compatible strategy. And many cases, if there are seeds coming from commercial firms, you will have to have the understanding and cooperation, the commercial firms to help the poor people. It is now a big problem in modern technology. You see, the Green Revolution generally said it was a product of public sector research. It was government research, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, maybe IDRC, all of that. But the Gene Revolution is a private sector enterprise. So that's my last point on the GMO, genetically modification, which is the basis of Gene Revolution. It is largely private sector enterprise, which are all covered by intellectual property rights, IPR rights. For example, in India, if I want to buy hybrid cotton seed, I have to pay to Monsanto for every kilogram of cotton seed I buy. Originally, it was 1,500 rupees, about 45 rupees. Canadian dollars will be 40 rupees per dollar. 1,500 rupees was the trait value. That was the IPR I was paying to the company for every kilogram. Formerly, they were keeping their own seeds. They were not buying from anybody. They were keeping their own seed. So it is very expensive. And I can see the company's point is we have invested money and our shareholders want return, and therefore we have to charge money and so on. One way is to do public sector research, more like CGIR. CGIR, the public good institutions or national research systems, if they get, for example, India, our own National Cotton Institute has produced an outstanding variety of BT cotton. Same genetically modified, but BT cotton, a variety, not a hybrid. So that if I'm a farmer, I buy that one, I can keep my own seed. I don't have to go again next year to the company. So your research strategy, should involve much more investment in public good research by public sector institutions, whether it is international like CGIAR or national research system. And secondly, we must have some agreement with the private sector to see how the technology can be made available in a more affordable problem. GMO is a very powerful technology. The more powerful technology, the more the power the technology, the more is the need for ethical consideration. You have to have much more bioethical considerations. Ethical in terms of social discrimination and access to technology, ethical in terms of safety aspects, environmental safety, biodiversity impact. So unless you have a regulatory mechanism which inspires public confidence, political confidence, professional confidence, and media confidence above all, you will not be able to use the technology very effectively. You must have a strong regulatory system. But may I tell you, I am a geneticist. I was a contemporary of Watson and Crick. I was studying in Cambridge at the same time Watson and Crick. They published their paper in 1953. I finished my PhD in 1952. I used to meet them frequently. I never thought they were going to make such earth-shaking in the institution. But from 53 onwards, we have now over 50 years of knowledge in the field of genetics, both medical genetics, agricultural genetics. Medical genetics is not so controversial as food genetics. People are concerned with food because they know Franken food, as Prince Charles' website, if you see, he will say, I will eat only organic food, not Franken food. So people, there is a fear in some cases. That can be done only by a regulatory system which inspires public political, professional confidence. But I would say don't throw the baby with the bathwater. In my own center, we have varieties of rice and other crops which are very tolerant to seawater, salt water. That cannot be produced. That cannot be produced because I have to have the genes to transfer the genes. If I have it in the varieties, then the International Rice Research Institute has over 100,000 varieties of rice in their gene bank, the world's largest gene bank. We believe that world has got about 150,000 varieties of rice. Over 100,000 fortunately are stored. And now the Norwegians in the seed vault, Svalbard seed vault, they are trying to preserve for posterity, like a Noah's Ark, preserve for posterity some sample of existing variability. You can do that. But the technology is very, very powerful. We have taken genes from one of the young ladies in my laboratory has taken genes from a very strong wild shrub, Prosopis juliflora, which grows with very little water. She has identified the genes for drought tolerance and transferred them. These cannot be done. As our pressure of population and land grows, we have to produce more and more from less land. And the smaller the farm, the greater is the need for marketable surplus. If I am a small farmer, unless I have more marketable surplus, I won't have cash income. That can come only from higher productivity. So I won't worship a tool, I won't worship a particular technology, but I also will not discard a technology on the basis of only some principles. Ethical principles are important. So my cloning is a very controversial issue in human being. But by and large, this is a part of genetics from Mendel's laws to modern, from Mendelian breeding to molecular breeding. It has been a set of evolutionary step, and we must know how to handle it properly.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swaminathan, for this very generous answer to the question that was raised on the GMO as well as the other. It comes the time for closing. And before doing so, I just want to give my thanks to the communication team of IDRC as well as our audio and video team, as well as our translator in the booth over there. Thank you very much for your good service. I think that we should thank also our audience for the quality of the question that was brought to your attention. I want to thank you all for the time, the quality of the discussion you brought. thanks also our people on the web that have been looking at this conversation with Dr. Swaminathan. But foremost, let me thank you. It has been an extraordinary journey this afternoon in time, in number of challenges, in number of examples that have been brought at the forefront that demonstrated that many times during those last 50 years, people like you were there, were inspiration, were thoughtful, and were able to meet the challenges. And probably one message that everyone will be taking home tonight, this afternoon, is that notwithstanding the complexity of the issue, food security is back on the agenda. There's a critical mass of people out there that have always been working on it, continue to be working on it, and will be continuing working on it. There's a number of governments that have put the shoulder to the wheel, and we hope that this will continue in the coming future in order to face and meet the challenges. But overall, for the last 40 years, IDRC has been in the field, but it's because of people like you. And I want to thank you for the very kind word you give to IDRC, but it's really us that have to thank you. And anytime you come to IDRC, you'll find a home. You'll be more than welcome. It is always a pleasure to have you with us. We wish you a safe journey to Alberta and probably back home afterward, and wishing you all the best in the continuation of what has been a remarkable and brilliant career, where I think the motto of IDRC about ID, innovation, and impact is powerfully transmitted through the type of work that you have been doing over your career. So it has been a privilege for me to spend the afternoon with you. I think it was for all of us. Thank you very much, and
thank you very much.
Have a good continuation.
It's a privilege to be in IDRC. Thank you.